If your ancestors could speak, this is what they'd want you to hear. Subscribe for more. One number decided it. Not a war, not a famine, not an invasion anyone wrote down. A number, buried in blood, that nobody could see for 6,000 years. Somewhere north of 400 million men walking around today. Driving buses in Chongqing, farming rice outside Nanning, teaching school in Harbin, carry, on their Y-chromosome, the unmistakable signature of one man, one farmer, one clan leader, one person who lived roughly 6,500 years ago in a river valley that would later be called the cradle of a civilization. He didn't found an empire. He didn't leave a name. He almost certainly never knew what he'd started. And yet, geneticists say, nearly 500 million living men today can trace their direct paternal line back to him and him alone. That number shouldn't exist, not under any normal model of population growth, not under the story usually told about how this population came to be, a story of one people, one place, one continuous river of blood flowing unbroken from the Neolithic to now. Here's the paradox researchers keep running into. The civilization built along this river is often described as one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. 5,000 years of recorded self-identity, unbroken. But when scientists opened up the DNA, what they found wasn't a single continuous thread, it was a patchwork. Stitched together, and stitched together far more recently, and far more violently than any schoolbook version of the story admits. The textbook lineage and the Y-chromosome lineage do not agree with each other. Somewhere in the genetic record, one paternal line expands, suddenly, explosively, in a narrow window of centuries. Not gradually, not evenly, explosively. So here's the question worth sitting with before we go further. If nearly 500 million men alive today share one father from 6.5 millennia ago, who was he, and why did everyone else's bloodline get erased? To understand how strange that number really is, you have to understand the story this population has told about itself for thousands of years. The standard account begins in the Yellow River Basin, in the fertile floodplains where millet farming first took hold. Archaeologists call the earliest layer of this story the Yangshao culture, followed by the Longshan culture, Neolithic communities that farmed, fired pottery, and built the first walled settlements in the region, sometime between roughly 5,000 and 2000 BCE. From there, the traditional narrative moves into legend. The era of the 5 emperors, semi-mythical culture heroes credited with inventing agriculture, medicine, and writing. Legend gives way to history with the Xia, then the Shang, then the Zhou dynasties. A chain of political succession stretching back more than 3,000 years, each dynasty claiming descent from, or at least continuity with, the one before it. The people themselves didn't call themselves Han for most of that span. That name came later, formalized during the Han dynasty, which ruled from 206 BCE to 220 CE. Over the following 2,000 years, Han became the dominant ethnic label for what is now roughly 92% of the population of modern China. An extraordinary act of cultural consolidation, one of the largest shared ethnonyms on the planet. The story that comes with that name is a story of continuity, near-continuous cultural transmission from the Yellow River outward. Bloodlines that absorbed newcomers rather than being replaced by them. A people who expanded, who assimilated, who never truly broke. Language reinforced the myth. The Sino-Tibetan language family was framed, for generations, as flowing from a single ancestral tongue outward. One people, one place, one story, echoed in grammar the way it was echoed in blood. And nothing reinforced the myth harder than the record-keeping itself. Confucian-era historiography placed enormous weight on ancestor veneration and genealogical precision. Clan registries, Zupu, were compiled, copied, and guarded for centuries, tracing named fathers and sons back dozens of generations. For a culture already inclined to believe in unbroken lines, these documents felt like proof, written proof, generation after generation, father to son, all the way back. One line, one people, one place. Except, and this is the detail almost nobody clocks until the DNA is checked, those same treasured genealogies, when set next to Y-chromosome data, produce numbers that shouldn't statistically exist under a story of slow, even population growth. Here is where it gets complicated. When geneticists sequenced the Y-chromosomes of men across East Asia, the DNA passed essentially unchanged from father to son, generation after generation. Like a name stamped on every page of a family Bible, one lineage stands out from all the others. It's labeled O2A2B1A1, though it used to go by an older name, O3M117, and its shape on a genetic family tree is unlike almost anything else researchers have mapped. Picture a family tree not as a tidy triangle branching evenly outward, but as a starburst, a single trunk exploding into dozens of branches all at once, all originating from nearly the same narrow moment in time, with almost no competing branches surviving alongside it. That's what O2A2B1A1 looks like, a star-shaped explosion frozen in genetic time, dated to somewhere around 6,500 years ago. A star pattern like that means one thing above all else. One man's descendants didn't just survive, they outcompeted nearly everyone else's. Their rivals' lines didn't merely grow slower, many of them appear to have ended altogether. The researcher most closely associated with identifying and naming this star cluster is Shi Yan, working with colleagues at Fudan University in Shanghai, whose published research in the mid-2010s brought this explosive expansion pattern into focus for the wider genetics community. The precise journal and the exact modern percentage carrying this lineage are figures still worth double-checking against the latest publications, but the scale researchers describe runs from tens of millions into the hundreds of millions of living men. That alone would be strange enough. But it gets stranger when you bring in a second study. In 2009, a team led by Zhu and colleagues at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, publishing in the American Journal of Human Genetics, mapped something else entirely. A hard, unmistakable genetic cline running north to south across people who all identify, today, as Han Chinese. Not a blended, homogeneous population, a gradient. Northern Han and Southern Han differ from each other genetically in ways that track tightly with geography, not with the unified bloodline the clan registries describe. North, South, different. And then there's the deeper layer, published more recently still. A 2020 study in the journal Cell, led by researchers including Fu and Yang, sequenced ancient genomes and found something the clan registries never mention at all. Two genetically distinct populations, diverging from each other roughly 9,500 years ago. One ancestral to northern millet farmers, the other to southern rice farmers. Two separate peoples, two separate agricultural traditions, two separate genetic histories that only merged, much later, into what we now call Han. Not by years, by centuries, sometimes millennia. These two founding populations stayed apart before any merger began. So the unbroken Yellow River bloodline from the clan registries turns out to be only half true, at best. Modern Han ancestry isn't one river flowing continuously from one Neolithic source. It's a merger, a genetic collision, between at least two founding populations that were, for thousands of years, as distinct from one another as separate ethnic groups entirely. Which leaves the obvious question sitting right in the middle of the wreckage of the old story. What event, 6,500 years ago, could cause one man's lineage to explosively out-reproduce everyone around him, hard enough to leave a starburst in the DNA of nearly 500 million of his descendants? The first theory researchers point to is one seen again and again across world genetics, the founder effect that comes with an agricultural revolution. Around 5,000 to 3,000 BCE, the Yangshao culture and its successor, the Miao-di-Go expansion phase, took hold across the Yellow River Basin. Millet farming, hardy, storable, reliable, allowed populations to grow in ways hunting and gathering never could. And whenever a population undergoes that kind of boom, the effect isn't distributed evenly. Whichever families happen to hold an early edge, better land, earlier adoption of farming techniques, positions of clan leadership, get to multiply that advantage across generations, out-reproducing their neighbors purely through accumulated demographic momentum. It's a pattern documented in the genetic record of farming populations from Europe to the Americas. Agriculture doesn't just feed more people, it privileges specific lineages within that growth. The timing lines up almost too well. Radiocarbon-dated Yangshao settlements cluster in that same 5,000 to 3,000 BCE window that overlaps the star cluster's roughly 6,500-year origin point. Researchers studying the overlap are careful to frame the connection as probability, not certainty. The precise paper directly correlating Yangshao settlement expansion with the O2A2B1A1 star cluster is still something to verify against the latest literature, but the chronological overlap itself is hard to dismiss. Founder effect, farming. Timing that lines up, it's a clean explanation, almost too clean, because here's the problem researchers keep running into. An agricultural boom on its own doesn't usually produce this narrow a signature. When farming lifts a whole region's population, you'd expect multiple successful lineages to expand together. Several winning families, several thriving clans, several branches all pushing outward at once. Not one single trunk, exploding into a starburst, while nearly every rival line goes silent. Pure economics doesn't erase bloodlines this completely. Something else was needed to explain why one line didn't just do well, it dominated, almost to the exclusion of everyone else. And that's where the story stops being about farming at all and starts being about something far harder to write down in a clan registry. Farming builds a stage. It doesn't hand one family the only seat on it. For that, you need something farming alone has never provided in any documented human population. Control. Not of land, of reproduction itself. The second theory researchers reach for isn't agricultural at all. It's political. And it has a precedent so well documented that geneticists already have a name for the pattern. In 2003, a team led by Zergel at Oxford University published findings on a Y-chromosome lineage tied to the era of the Mongol Empire, a lineage now carried by roughly 16 million men scattered across a huge swath of Asia, all descending from a single founder estimated to have lived around 1,000 years ago. That founder's identity is widely linked, though not universally proven beyond doubt, to the ruling house of Genghis Khan. The mechanism wasn't better crops. It was power, concentrated, generational, reproductive power, where one man and his male descendants held political authority for centuries, and used it to father far more children than anyone around them, generation after generation, through polygyny, concubinage, and hereditary privilege. Picture it like a single tap left running, while every other tap in the house gets turned down to a drip. Over enough generations, the tub only fills from one source. If that mechanism could push one lineage to roughly 8% of men across a continental region in less than 1,000 years, researchers argue, something structurally similar, sustained elite control over reproduction, not shared agricultural prosperity, is a far better fit for a star pattern this narrow. A farming boom lifts many families a little. A ruling lineage's monopoly lifts one family enormously, at everyone else's expense. There's a complication, though, and researchers are careful to frame it as probability, not certainty. The Yellow River star cluster is nearly 6 times older than the Mongol case. No surviving record names this earlier founder, no dynasty claims him, no inscription, no tomb, no title. Genghis Khan left an empire with his name stamped on it. Whoever sits at the root of O2A2B1A1 left nothing but a signature buried in the Y-chromosomes of hundreds of millions of men who have never heard of him. And here is the reframe that changes everything that came before it. The Yangshao farming boom wasn't the cause of the star cluster, it was the stage. The real driver, most researchers now lean toward, was concentrated hereditary power sitting on top of that agricultural surplus. A small ruling lineage that didn't just benefit from the boom, but controlled who got to reproduce within it. Which brings the story to a theory most researchers are far more hesitant to say out loud. The third and most speculative explanation doesn't come from a genetics lab at all. It comes from myth, and from the uncomfortable coincidence of timing between a genetic signature and a legendary name. Chinese cultural memory preserves the figure of the Yellow Emperor Huangdi, a legendary culture hero credited in tradition with founding the customs, medicine, and governance of the Huaxia peoples, and traditionally placed in roughly the same era the star cluster appears to originate. No rigorous, peer-reviewed genetic study has confirmed any direct identity between this legendary figure and the star cluster founder. That link remains folk speculation, layered by commentators and popular media onto real genetic data, not something demonstrated in a journal. But the coincidence is hard to ignore entirely. Is a 4,000-year-old oral legend a distorted cultural memory of a real, dominant Bronze Age patriarch, passed down and mythologized over 100 generations? Or is it pure coincidence? 2 unrelated timelines, one genetic and one narrative, that happen to overlap in a way that feels meaningful only because we want it to. Nobody currently studying this data claims to know, to feel how physically real this abstraction actually is. Picture standing on the lowest terraces above the Yellow River roughly 6,000 years ago, inside a Yangshao culture village not unlike the excavated sites at Banpo or Zhangzhai. The ground beneath your feet is packed yellow earth. Around you, semi-subterranean pit houses sit dug half into the hillside, their roofs low, their walls warm with the smell of wood smoke and stored grain. Painted pottery basins, red and black geometric patterns, fish and human faces worked into the clay, sit stacked near the household stores of millet, the crop that made all of this possible. Walk to the edge of the settlement and you reach the communal cemetery. Most graves here are simple: a shallow pit, a body, a handful of everyday tools laid alongside it. But a few graves are different, richer, wider, filled with finer pottery, more elaborate goods, sometimes set slightly apart from the rest. Archaeologists reading sites like this see an early signature of something the pots and pit houses alone can't prove: status, inherited status, the first visible cracks of hereditary inequality inside a society that, on paper, looks uniformly agricultural. Somewhere inside a village exactly like this one household's sons outcompeted every other household's sons. Not for one generation, not for 10, but for roughly 250 generations in a row. That is not luck. That is not farming alone. That is a system, sustained across millennia, quietly and repeatedly favoring one bloodline over all its neighbors. Here is where the story stops being about one man at all. Because the deeper reveal, the one the star cluster was only ever a symptom of, is this. Han Chinese was never a single continuous bloodline flowing unbroken from one Neolithic source. It is, and always was, a process, a millennia-long act of absorption, in which dozens of once genuinely distinct peoples were folded into a single cultural and linguistic identity, while remaining, underneath that identity, genetically layered and regionally distinct. The 2009 Zhu Studies Hard North-South Genetic Cline. The 2020 Yang and Fu sequencing showing two founding populations, northern millet farmers, southern rice farmers, diverging 9,500 years ago before ever merging. Layer onto that the Baiyue populations of the far south, the Chu and Bashu peoples of the middle Yangtze, and countless smaller groups absorbed over dynasty after dynasty. None of these were Han to begin with. All of them became Han. Culturally, linguistically, administratively, while their genomes kept quiet, separate records of where they'd actually come from. Distinct, absorbed, renamed. The star cluster lineage, that one man's staggering, near half-billion-strong genetic footprint, isn't the whole story after all. It's one especially visible thread pulled tight through a much larger, messier tapestry. Proof, if anything, that a shared identity was built on top of deep underlying diversity, not instead of it. Dr. Li Hui, a population geneticist who has worked extensively on East Asian Y-chromosome lineages, has described this kind of finding to students in plainer terms than any journal abstract allows. The DNA doesn't care what we call ourselves. It only remembers who actually had children and with whom. That's the whole of what a lineage is. Not a flag, not a name, just a chain of fathers and sons that happened, for reasons still not fully settled, to outlast its rivals. So the opening number holds. Nearly 500 million men alive today really do descend from one man who lived roughly 6,500 years ago. That part is real. But it was never a story about one unbroken people moving through history untouched. It's the story of one extraordinarily successful lineage riding inside a far larger, far messier genetic merger. A merger built from farmers who never met each other, cultures that once had nothing in common, and a ruling bloodline whose name has been lost even as its descendants number in the hundreds of millions. And this pattern isn't unique to one river valley. Pull the thread on almost any large national or ethnic identity, European, Middle Eastern, South Asian, or otherwise, and the same shape appears underneath. A retrospective story of unity, laid like a bridge over a genetically layered, often violent history of populations merging, absorbing, and erasing one another long before anyone wrote the official version down. The Yellow River doesn't run one direction only in this story. It carries silt from 100 different tributaries, mixed so thoroughly upstream that by the time it reaches the sea, it looks like a single, unbroken current. And that, more than any dynasty or clan registry, is the truest picture of where 400 million men's fathers actually came from. The Chinese were never one unbroken bloodline. The DNA doesn't erase that story. It just proves there was always more than one river feeding it.